Hey Ninja viewers, how you doing? It's day 8 of Vlogmas. Today we are going to talk about how I edit my DJI Mavic Pro footage and the camera settings I typically use. And stay tuned all the way to the end and you'll find out what happened to Vlogmas day 7. One of the questions I often get is how do you get the best quality footage from the drone itself? And a couple of you I found out were actually trying to grab the footage directly from the remote to your iPhone, and I don't recommend doing that. While you technically can stream footage from the drone to your camera to your phone and record it that way, you're susceptible to interference and the bandwidth issues and the signal drop and things like that, and so you're not going to get the best quality pictures. No matter what, you're going to be starting from a hampered position to begin with. The Mavic comes with a 16 gigabyte micro SD card. I actually upgraded mine to a 32 gig SD card. 16 gig card gives you about a half hour's worth of footage, and a 32 gig card gives you about an hour footage. And so the best way to get the video footage to start would be to grab that SD card, take it out of your Mavic, and I use a USB stick. This one's called, it's from Transcend. It's a USB 3.0. It is an SD card reader, and it reads micro SD and regular SD cards. I use this to, I basically take the micro SD card out of here, I pop it in that little sucker, and I grab the files directly from the card that way. The Mavic also has a USB cable here, connector here, where you can actually grab it that way, but then you have to power the drone on in order to access it, and it just seems faster and more efficient to grab the footage directly from the card. So once I've done that, let's talk about the settings that I use on the actual Mavic drone itself. Since I do all of my YouTube videos in 1080p, and I record on this camera, and I try to record at 24 frames per second because it gives me the most light to work with, and it also gives me a more cinematic feel. 1/50th shutter speed, which is double the frames per second. And when you shoot at double the frames per second, that gives a nice motion blur effect. So when cars are driving by on the street, or if there's fast motion, there's a soft blurring effect that happens that your eyes become accustomed to, particularly all the years of watching film on the big screen in the movies. It approximates the look and feel of film. We don't have film anymore, everything's digital. So by filming at 24 frames per second, I have the best chance of gathering the most light. I can shoot in lower light, and at 1/50th shutter speed, which is essentially you double the frames per second to determine that gives me a nice motion blur and gives me a more cinematic feel. And since I shoot that way for my videos with this camera, I then do the same thing on the Mavic. I shoot at 1080p, 24 frames per second. Now, unfortunately, the aperture on the Mavic is fixed at 2.2, which means you can't adjust, you can't bring the f-stop down in order to compensate for the fact that you're running at a slower shutter speed of 1/50th. So sometimes on the Mavic, I'm shooting at 1080p, 24 frames per second, but since the aperture is fixed at 2.2, that means the shutter speed is the only way to adjust exposure and ISO, of course. So I try to shoot at as low as ISO as possible without having to run the shutter speed so slow, lower than 50 frames per second. But in high light conditions, when it's very sunny out, or even when it's cloudy but there's a lot of light and it's the midday, I end up having to run at a very fast shutter speed in order to keep from overexposing the footage. So unfortunately, in many cases, the footage from the Mavic is going to look more digital, what I call the soap opera effect, where the footage is just almost too crisp, almost video game crisp, and it almost seems unnatural. It kind of you lose some of that smooth blurring and cinematic effect that you get in, higher quality film. Now, you can compensate for that in post in Adobe After Effects. I can apply a motion blur effect, but oftentimes I'm trying to get a video out every day. It's in the editing is time consuming enough as it is, so I don't always get around to it or have the time or inclination. In any event, I don't shoot in 4K on the Mavic because my computer is getting a little aged, and since I don't do 4K video in general, that means I have to downsample. If I want to get good quality video, I have to downsample at a very high bit rate to 1080p, which takes time, and I'm all about saving time. Now, if I was editing 4K video across the board, I would still shoot at 24 frames per second. I would just shoot at 4K instead of 1080p, and that would mean I'll also be shooting at 4K, which means that my computer would need to be much faster because you're basically dealing with footage that is 4 times larger than 1080p. And so rendering and processing time goes up, and even editing can go up because now you have to have a machine that can handle processing 4K video. And when you're talking about an hour or 2 hours worth of footage and trying to edit that down to a 10, 12-minute video and then kicking that out to 4K at a high bit rate, massive files, lots of time, my computer, and I'm just not there. So for now, since 4K has not been widely adopted across the board, I stick to 1080p, 24 frames per second, and I try to shoot at a shutter speed of 1/50th if I can. And on the Mavic, if I can't get 1/50th shutter speed, which oftentimes I can't, but I still want a very cinematic look and feel, I'll bring it into Adobe After Effects and then add a motion blur to it in order to get that effect before I bring it into Adobe Premiere. So let's talk about editing. I use Adobe Premiere CC. So your editing software may be different, but a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today, maybe not the how you do it, but the concepts will be the same for you as well. Exposure. When I launch the Mavic, I turn off all the auto settings for white balance and for exposure because I don't want it changing mid-flight. If you have it set to auto, you'll notice sometimes in the footage, you'll have a drastic change in exposure or in white balance because the camera will shift it based on where the sun is and where shadows are and things like that. So what I do is I put it on manual. So I'll get the drone in the air, I'll point it at the sky, I will set my exposure to the sky opposite of where the sun is. So if the sun is right there, I'm going to point the drone in the opposite direction and set my exposure there. I'm going to set my white balance to whether it's cloudy or sunny. I'm going to set my exposure to where the sky and clouds and features are still noticeable and the ground and things underneath are not too dark. And once I do that, I leave that setting for the entire flight and for the footage I'm taking. If there's a drastic light change, I might stop recording, do another manual adjustment, and then continue recording. But the idea being you don't want to have changes happening mid-shot because that ruins the cinematic feel, in my opinion, and can be very hard to color grade and have control over the footage later if things are if it's kind of a moving target, particularly if you've got a nice sweeping shot and you're happy with it, but in the middle of it you had a light change because the automatic filters changed. So you've done all that stuff. You've set your manual footage, you've recorded it, you've got your footage on your card, and you moved it over into Adobe Premiere. So let's go ahead and pop into Adobe Premiere and talk to you. I'm going to walk you through how I do color grading and how I export my videos in order to get a nice, smooth, quality DJI Mavic footage. So let's check it out.
Okay, Ninja viewers, here we are in Adobe Premiere. I've already grabbed three movies from my Mavic, from my micro SD card from the Mavic, and I've brought them into Adobe Premiere. I have 3 styles here. The first video clip I recorded in 1080p, 24 frames per second, whatever shutter speed was necessary for exposure. But this one was recorded in CINELIKE-D, which is a color profile that you can record. These two are recorded in standard mode with no style and no color mode or any grading chosen whatsoever. So, and we're going to talk about why I prefer to go that route nowadays. However, occasionally, if I want really finite control over color grading, I still might shoot in the Cinelike-D or what's called D-Log. And what those do is they shoot a rather flat image. I don't know if you can really tell here, but this image is rather flat on the screen here. That allows us then to really punch up the dynamic range of the highlights versus the shadows and all of the colors in between, and can give you a much more cinematic looking color grade because you're starting with a more muted and flat image, which allows us a lot more control, where the standard version here, see how the color is much punchier and brighter and more intense. It's a little more difficult to color grade if you're going to color grade from scratch. Let's start with this one. Now, when I usually do my clips, keeping with this cinematic theme, I like to choose clips where the camera and the gimbal and the motion is all fluid and not jerky and not suddenly changing motions. So, like, here's where we're coming up to the railroad tracks here, and I got some cars, so I might start right about here. So I'm going to set my in right here for my start of my clip. And then as I'm crossing over the railroad tracks, I'm just going to kind of scrub along here and see how this clip is going. And you see right there, see where I suddenly switched from moving in a strafing formation back across the road, and I suddenly did a turn, and it's rather abrupt. That to me is not cinematic. So I'm going to do my cut just before we do that right here. So now we have a nice, if I take this down here and throw it on my timeline, we have a nice, much more fluid clip where I don't have a sudden change in direction or motion, and it feels nice and cinematic, right? And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an adjustment layer so that when we do our color grading, we can affect it on the adjustment layer and not actually mess with the color grading and exposure settings on the actual clip itself. And if we don't like what we did, we can delete this layer and start over. We can turn it on and off, or we could even duplicate it on other clips if we have multiple shots that are using the same profile. So the first thing I'll do is mess with the exposure, and I like to start with, I go to basic correction. Now, the lumetri color in Adobe Premiere Pro CC is fairly new. I'm not sure which version they introduced it, but it makes for very fast and easy color grading. So what I'll do is I'll start with the exposure. I'll go ahead and hit auto, and just as a place to start. Now, sometimes I hit auto and it doesn't do a very good job and I don't like it, but in this case, I actually feel pretty good. Let's turn that adjustment layer off, and you see it's a little underexposed, and when we did the auto, I feel pretty good about the decisions it's made. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that for now. However, I'm not convinced that the white balance is quite where it needs to be, so there's this white barn right here, so I'm going to go ahead and hit that and see what we get. And it looks like I feel pretty good about that change. It gives it a little bit warmer feel. But if you hit that and you decide you didn't like it, you can always change your temperature and tint back to 0 to get it back to ground zero. But I actually feel pretty good about this change. So I'm going to go ahead and use my white balance on that barn again, and we're going to roll with that. Then the next step we're going to do is we're going to go to the Creative tab in Lumetri, and we're going to choose the CineSpace LUT. These are all easy, like predefined LUTs that come stock, except for these C5Ds. We'll talk about those in a second. But CineSpace and all these other ones, you can play with them. I prefer CineSpace. It's just one of the ones that I like to work with. Let's go ahead and apply that LUT. Now, right out of the box, this makes it a little bit too contrasty and a little bit too dark. So I think we're probably going to bring that down just a tad. So I'm going to bring the intensity about 30%. So you can see now that gave it, it's a little dark and kind of faded looking. Now we've got a little bit more punch. I'm going to bring it up, let's bring it up to 40. Let's give it a little bit more intensity. And I think it's sharp enough. I don't want to bring the sharpness up too much in this because it'll bring these sharp edges like this and the railroad tracks and the roads, it'll start to look jagged if I make it too sharp. So I feel everything looks pretty in focus and sharp, so I'm not too worried about that. But I am going to bump the vibrance up a little bit and the saturation up a little bit. Whoops. There we go. So now, if we turn this adjustment layer off, this is what it looked like before. Very flat and a little underexposed, but now a little bit more exposed, a little brighter, a little bit more interesting looking, a little more cinematic. So if I go ahead and preview that play, you can see I think it looks pretty good now. Now you can keep playing with these things and tweaking them, but that was starting from I think this was shot in Cinelike-D, wasn't in straight D-Log mode, but Cinelike-D. And then very quickly we just went in and adjusted the exposure, did a little white balance correction, and then threw this CineSpace LUT on there and did a few more tweaks, and now we've got some pretty good looking footage. Okay, so let's talk about another way that we can do this. Let's check out this clip. This one was done in standard mode, and as you can see, the colors are much brighter, more saturated, definitely more punchy. Same thing, from a cinematic standpoint, we're looking for a continuous looking shot where we don't have sudden shifts. I like how there's this car activity happening down here, so I'm gonna start my in right here. And I'm moving along, and I'm coming up to the street here. Oh, and you see, there we go. So I hit the street there, and then there's this sudden change in gimbal and direction. That is very uncinematic. So right before we start to make that change, I'm gonna do my out. So there's my second clip, and we'll throw an adjustment layer up on top of that as well. And just like before, let's go ahead and hit auto exposure and see what we get. That brings it up just a little too bright in my opinion. I feel like it was kind of dark, but now that's a little too bright. So I'm going to bring it up a half a stop instead of a full stop. That feels a little better to me. Yeah, it's a little brighter. And then creative, instead of CineSpace right here, I'm going to use one of these Cinema5D LUTs. Now, these are free. They give you 4 of them. And I'm going to show you the website here in a second. My personal favorite right here is the W3010 for Mavic. And you see I apply that right away. It changes it to a redder, sort of more earth tones, more landscape cinematic looking feel. It's a little less blue and punchy and saturated, and a little more earth tones. And it appeals to me personally. I really like it. I think it makes for a very nice looking cinematic, quick way to get a cinematic looking shot. And the website. This is a link in the description as well. Basically, you go here to this page. It'll be in the description. You put in your name and email, and you hit submit, and you'll get an email, and they'll give you downloads as well as instructions for how to install these guys. I'm not sponsored by this. I'm not affiliated with them in any way. I just found these guys, and I really like how quick and easy it is to get some cinematic-looking footage that looks very sharp. And I've installed it in Premiere, and I've been using it in most of my videos ever since I found it. So let's go ahead and sharpness is still okay, I think, but I'm going to add a little bit more vibrance and a little bit more saturation on that. And then to me, that is a really, you see kind of over here, this is the source file, and this is the finished look. I just think that looks great. I think it looks great. Now this is one with all of the cars moving in here that I won't do that in this video, but I would take into Adobe Premiere, or I'm sorry, Adobe After Effects, and apply a motion blur so that these cars look a little less, I don't know if you can see, they seem, as we get closer, the way that they're moving, they almost look like a video game, and the motion blur will help make that look a little more cinematic, a little bit more like you would see on film, old style film, and things like that. So there's our 2 examples. We've got this one where we started with the Cinelike-D and did our own, used one of the stock LUTs that came out of the box with Premiere, and this one, which was specifically geared for the DJI Mavic Pro, which I personally prefer. So I've been using them ever since. Those are two great quick ways for you to get some cinematic looking color grading on your footage, and a couple tips for making sure that you choose cinematic looking clips out of your footage so we don't have any abrupt changes in direction or abrupt gimbal changes or sudden movements of the camera. This makes it feel a little bit more fluid. There's a lot of, we could go even deeper into that theory, but this is just a basic thing for how I color grade. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is this one right here. Coincidentally, you'll notice if you're looking closely, two of these are in the .mov, which is the Apple QuickTime format. One of these is the MP4. I've personally found no discernible difference in quality between the MP4 or the MOV in terms of YouTube videos are concerned. So whichever one works with your editor, have at it. To me, it doesn't seem to make, from what I can see, doesn't seem to make any difference whatsoever. So I've played around with both. I've settled on the .mov format, but the MP4 seems to work just as well. So whichever you want to choose. But now this video, let's talk about kicking the footage, how you kick the footage out into when you're ready to actually save this footage. I want to show you this video right here. This was saved with the standard 8-bit YouTube format for 1080p video. And I don't know if you can see, but look at the banding here and the artifacts. See all of how mushy and muddy and blurry and everything is? That's because I exported this video out of Adobe Premiere using the 8-bit standard that YouTube chooses for its quality. And this is what you get. And what I've changed moving forward is when I go to export these files, if I go to export this movie, I've created a Ninja 614 YouTube setup. But these are the settings I use. My bitrate encoding I changed from VBR 1 pass to 2 pass, and I changed my target bitrate and max bitrate to 75, and I render at maximum depth. This makes my files much larger when I go to export them. So a 10-minute video would be about 1 to 1.1 gigabytes. Now they're around 6 to 7 gigabytes, and it takes quite a bit longer to upload. But the difference in quality in terms of no more artifacts or pixelation or this weird, mushy, muddy-looking footage. Particularly in footage like this where you have a lot of trees, it's just the low bit rate creates a really ugly-looking output. This was one of the final videos that I kicked out the first day I got the Mavic. First video I ever did. And I just cringe when I look at it now. So if whatever editing software that you're using, when you go to encode it for YouTube using the H.264 format, the 1080p, use the 2-pass VBR and set a target bit rate of 75 with a max bit rate of 75 and render at the maximum depth for your footage. It takes longer and it's bigger files, but you'll be much happier with the end results when it goes up on YouTube. So even though YouTube is asking you to do 8-bit, if you start at a much higher 8-bit, whatever they're doing on the back end for the post-process once you've uploaded that file, it definitely seems to be making a very big difference. So there you go. That's my, 10, 15-minute stint on how I do color grading and then how I kick my files out of Adobe Premiere for you. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on YouTube, hit me up on Facebook, hit me up on Twitter. I'm more than willing to answer your questions or help you out in any way, shape, or form. I'm sorry, I just hit my mic. But if you are experienced professional, I'm assuming you probably know all these things. This video is really geared towards people who are just getting into doing YouTube videos and using their Mavic drones in their footage. Hopefully these are the lessons that I've learned so far. If I come up with any new tips or tricks, I'll share them in the future. But there you go.
Okay, so there you go. That is how you. This is how I do it in terms of color grading for the Mavic. I hope you found that helpful. I hope that if you don't have Adobe Premiere, you're able to apply some of the things that I'm doing to your editing software and get the results. I know that the Cinema5D LUTs files that you get will work with any editing software that supports LUT files. So you can get those files and just use them. But the principles that we're talking about should apply the same in terms of choosing your clips, applying your color grades, applying your exposures, and all that fun stuff. So hopefully that helps. Now, real quick, I promise you to find out what happened to day 7 of VLOGmas, so here it is. What's up, Ninja viewers? It is actually Wednesday today, the 7th of December. And just so that I don't miss vlogging every single day and VLOGmas in December of 2016, this entry right here shall serve as the Wednesday, December 7th entry. That's all you get for today. It's just one of those days. Nothing really happened except life. But it just got away from me. And the sun is down. And so back at full video tomorrow. It'll be combined. Let this serve as your Wednesday video. I love you guys. Thanks for tuning in. Haha, and I thought I was cheating on days 4 and 5. Anyway, it did happen. Some vlogging happened on day 7. All right, Ninja viewers, thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for subscribing. Thanks so much for participating in my videos and liking and commenting and sharing and all that fun stuff. I really, truly do appreciate it. And I'm so pleased that you guys are liking my stuff. All right. That means I shall see you all tomorrow. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share these videos. Ninja viewers are the best. And you know it. Bye.